Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special broadcast. I am joined by renowned economist Stephen Moore, who has worked for many, many different institutions. He's now with FreedomWorks as their senior economist, and he was a senior advisor on economics in the Trump administration. And we're going to talk about his new book, Govzilla, which I think you all can see there. I know with the blurred background, it's a little hard, but the subtitle is How the Relentless Growth of Government is Devouring Our Economy and Our Freedom. So, Stephen Moore, so great to speak with you. Thank you so much for coming on to share your book.
Thank you.
Could you explain what the impetus behind the book was? Why did you write it at this time?
Well, I think when Biden was elected and I saw these multi-trillions of dollars of spending initiatives that Biden was proposing, we've spent something like $7 trillion on COVID and all the related expenditures. And by the way, some of that was under Trump as well. And I just saw this explosion of government spending and debt. And you could see that this whole idea of America being a country of limited government was really falling apart. And so just to give you a sense of what's happened, I mean, just in the last few years, when I first came to Washington in 1985 under Reagan, worked in the Reagan budget office, the budget was $1 trillion, 1 trillion. And today, well, last year in 2021, we spent 7 trillion, just short of $7 trillion. So this has been a relentless growth of government. And it's very simple. Every time the government spends a dollar, it has to take a dollar from someone, you or me or someone else. So the idea that government adds to the economy, I mean, I'm a libertarian, but obviously the government has to provide a national defense in our roads and highways and our court system and our prisons. But we've expanded government so much, and now we're paying people massive amounts of money not to work. We have a record low labor force participation rate. We have a record high inflation rate. Almost all of these problems have not been solved by government. They've been created by government. In fact, the first quote in the book is by Ronald Reagan that said, Reagan used to say that a government that is big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take everything you've got. And we're approaching that point.
Certainly, big government does impede on economic progress and economic prosperity. And something I think people haven't seen, especially young people, is kind of this embrace of big government. We do see it largely with the Biden administration. We see them try to stifle any creativity. They really dislike decentralization, whether it's in the form of digital currency or even the type of workforce that's emerging. Something that happened last night that you may be aware of was one of Biden's top labor picks, David Weil, was defeated in the Senate cloture vote. And you talked about labor policy and kind of this forced unionization push by Biden's administration. Even though they're saying that big labor is advancing, there's momentum for it, they are shrinking as a workforce. They lost 5.5% of their participation. Freelance has grown and stayed consistent. And it seems like they just can't catch a hint with where the economy is trending, kind of this freelance flexible arrangement. What are your thoughts on that, on this forced unionization push, and will it succeed?
One of the things I find very disturbing about the Biden agenda has been the idea of forcing people to join unions. And, I'm not against unions. I do believe in the First Amendment right of people to assemble and join organizations, but I don't think the First Amendment also gives you the right not to associate. And so what Biden wants to do is force millions of Americans against their will to join a union and to pay union dues, whether they agree with the union policies or not. To me, that's anti-American. A lot of Americans don't want to join a union because they don't want to be under a collective bargaining agreement. They want to, if you're a high-performing employee, you want to get a pay raise because you're one of the highest performing people. You don't want to be under some kind of pay grade system. And so there are now 26 states, I believe it's 26 or 27 states that are right to work states, which means you're not, you can join the union if you want to, but if you don't want to join the union, or you don't have to pay the dues. And that's what I think all America should be. We should be a right to work country. Biden wants to make us a forced union, closed shop country where unions would have all the authority, and that takes power away from individuals.
And I saw a study, I forget which academic journal it was, but it said that actually workers in right to work states, if they're unionized especially, they're even happier than in non-right to work states as well. So
be surprised. So you're seeing, we've been doing a lot of studies on this over the last 10 or 15 years. And what we found consistently is that states that are right to work states, and think of what states those are: Florida, Texas, Utah, Idaho, states in the South like South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee. Those states have twice the job creation rates of states that have forced union policies. When I was at the Wall Street Journal, we used to talk to CEOs of companies all the time. And they used to say, if we're building a new manufacturing facility or a construction site or a new plant, we don't even consider a state unless it's right to work. So states like New York, Illinois, California, New Jersey, Michigan, they've taken themselves out of the game because nobody wants to locate in a state that forces people to join a union.
Here in Virginia, too, we have an economic development partnership that has also said that in terms of attracting an investment into the state, largely right to work is a consideration. And we're starting to see some businesses come here more than I think we've seen before. So our right to work legislation here, or our right to work standards here, have kept us kind of in check against changing levers of power here, too. Let's talk about economics a bit more before I ask you about energy. But kind of related to your book, we heard a policy recently revealed by the Biden administration to potentially tax unrealized capital gains on billionaires, and I think by extension, millionaires. How would that affect people who are not millionaires and billionaires? Because like any centralized type of scheme in terms of taxation, it often trickles down to everyone else. Could you explain how those implications would work out and bear out for the rest of us?
Well, let me first kind of unmask a lie that Biden has said repeatedly over the last few weeks. I think he said at least 4 or 5 times that, people in the top 1% of income only pay 8% of their income in taxes. That's not even in the neighborhood, the zip code of the truth. The fact is the top 1% in America pay about 40% of the income tax. So 1% pay 40%. The top 1% pay more than 90% of Americans in taxes. So we have an extraordinarily progressive tax system, probably the most progressive tax system in the world. So this idea that all these rich people are getting away with paying nothing. Now, are there some who may find loopholes to avoid paying taxes? There may well be, but who wrote the tax code? Joe Biden, you were in Congress for 50 years. If you're so concerned about all these loopholes, why didn't you do something about it when you were there? So now let's get to this issue of unrealized capital gains. First of all, do not believe for a minute that they're going to only do this for millionaires and billionaires. That's how they got the income tax passed in the first. Oh, this is only going to attack the millionaires. And that was when $1 million was worth a lot of money 100 years ago. And then we had something called the alternative minimum tax. That was first enacted in the late 1960s because there were like 100 very rich people who were not paying much income tax. And then with both of those things, the income tax and the alternative minimum tax, within a few years, everybody was paying the tax. And so this is just a foot in the door to tax unrealized stock valuations. So think about it very simple. Let's make this really simple. Let's say that you own 1,000 shares of AT&T stock. And let's say that those 1,000 shares last year went up. So you made $10,000 in a gain in owning those stocks. But you didn't sell the stock. You just continue to own it, but its value has gone up by $10,000. They want to tax you on that $10,000. Well, where are you going to get the money to pay the tax? You didn't sell the stock. You don't have any cash to pay it. So this is an incredibly anti-American idea. Can you imagine how you're going to figure out what the tax is worth, how much you owe? You're going to have legions of new IRS agents. The complications are crazy. So I think this is a horrific, horrific idea.
Does it tie in with MMT, modern monetary theory? I think you alluded to it in your book as well. Mm-hmm. And some of my friends who study economics have joked it's magical money tree.
Yeah, magical money tree. That's exactly what it is. So this is what I think is really deeply disturbing. I remember about 6 or 7 years ago when I first heard about this dingbat idea of modern monetary theory, which, by the way, just means that the government, as long as the U.S. is the world reserve currency, which we are, thank God, we can continue to borrow and borrow and borrow and spend and spend and spend. and it's not going to cost us anything. Well, that's like saying you and I, can just keep running up our credit card, right? And it's not going to cost us anything, but bills come due. And so the idea that we can just keep borrowing like this is a long and winding road to a catastrophe. And so but that they are actually implementing this idea in the Biden administration. They don't think that there's any cost to all this spending and borrowing. And, tell me any country in the world that has had an out of control budget and an out of control debt where that story's had a happy ending. It always leads to a crash ending, a very miserable ending. So we've got to stop pretending that we don't have to pay our bills. And this really is one of the points I make in my book is that, when our country was founded, it really was founded on the idea of very limited federal government that had some, what we call enumerated powers, having a national defense and a postal service and roads and a criminal justice system and so on. But it was supposed to be, I love to talk about what I call the forgotten 9th and 10th Amendments. I bet most of the people watching or listening to this show don't even know what's in the 9th and 10th Amendment. And that's because we never talk about it. But the 9th and 10th Amendments basically say that all powers not specifically granted to the federal government reside with the states and the people, We've moved so far away from that issue. Now, every time there's a problem, we turn to the federal government to spend money and solve it. And of course, most of the time, the federal government makes it worse. I mean, look at the COVID response. Look at the disaster of lockdowns, of curfews, of stay-at-home policies, of shutting down our schools. This is going to go down as one of the greatest epic failures of big government in the history of our country. The damage that was done by lockdowns and school closures and shutting down businesses was orders of magnitude higher than any benefits. And so when people say, oh, we should trust the government to do the right thing, why should we? Look at all the mistakes that have been made in recent years. Look at how they're bankrupting our country. Look at the damage they did to our children. I say that, the COVID measures by government were the greatest episode of national child abuse in the history of this country. So the government has a lot of answering to do. And I love the lesson. We have to trust government more. Why? Why would we trust government when every decision they've made the last 20 years has been wrong?
I want to ask you a final thing before I let you go, Stephen. We start to see kind of this flirtation in conservatism. This is something I'm noticing, and it's kind of alarming me that some people are wanting us to move away from economic conservatism, which is one of the three pillars of fusionist conservatism that has led to this movement coming to the forefront. It's something as a young conservative, I'm in my 30s, so I see it a little differently than some of the younger conservatives who came after me. But do you worry about this?
You're making me feel old when you say, you're people younger than you are. So,
but do you worry about this kind of push? Although maybe it's just exclusive to the internet, but I start to see some inklings in this direction. But if we abandon economic conservatism, would we lose out on keeping people in the kind of big tent framework that conservatism has been able to draw, especially the gains that President Trump made with bringing in new voters, if we embrace a more economic populist message?
I'm not really sure what that economically populist message is. I think free market capitalism is populist. People who say, I'm really been so lucky in my life because I've met some of the most extraordinary people, whether it was Ronald Reagan or William F. Buckley or Milton Friedman or Julian Simon, so many incredibly brilliant people. And I remember towards the end of his life, Milton Friedman, who was, one of the 3 or 4 greatest economists who ever walked on this planet. I was, privileged enough to spend time with him towards the end of his life. And I remember after the Berlin Wall came down and communism was finally defeated, that we saw this kind of reemergence of socialism, and he was just so puzzled and disheartened by this. He said, Steve, the whole lesson of the 20th century, if there's any enduring lesson of the 20th century, he said, and he's absolutely right about this, it is that free enterprise works, and all these other isms, socialism, Maoism, communism, thisism, thatism, all of these ideas of expanding government, they're failures, right? I mean, that's why the Soviet Union fell. It's why, the communist China didn't become a world power until they moved back towards capitalism, away from communism. And so, we keep saying, well, yet people have seemed to learn, well, we just need more socialism. No, we need more free enterprise. We need more capitalism in the truest sense of the word. And so when people say, well, let's move away from capitalism, what they're saying is, let's make America poor. And by the way, when you do that, the people who suffer the most are the people at the bottom. Look at the socialist countries. The poor are the ones who suffer the most in those countries. It doesn't equalize. And to the extent it does equalize, it makes people equally poor. So I don't really even understand the economic logic of this to move away from the free enterprise system. Economics is not complicated. We have hundreds and hundreds of years of evidence that show that it's really simple. Free trade, lower taxes, limited government, private property rights, a rule of law. Those are the basic building blocks of a productive, fast-growing economy where, by the way, people are happier and more productive and richer in those countries. So I don't really understand the logic. Like, why? Why would we move away from economic conservatism? Because all you're going to do is make people poor.
Well put. I hope those populists do listen to you say that, since you have formalized training in economics.
Can you make sure every one of those people reads my book? Because
certainly
the cancer cell of our economy, which is metastasizing right now, is big government. We have to slash government. We should cut it in half. Moore's theorem is that we would get better government if we cut every single government in America in half.
Not a bad idea. I think government has certainly become too big and encroaching. And as a freelancer, I don't like their attacks on my livelihood as well. But Stephen Moore, author of Govzilla.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking with me. Great to talk to you.
You too. Thanks so much. Take care.